This is lecture 4, and this video will take a look at the chapter on fossil evidence. So just a reminder, to this point we have explored the first question or claim of the theory of evolution, which dealt with the creative power of natural selection. Can natural selection as a process produce fundamentally new life forms? Now we switch to the other question, the other claim of the theory, which looks at the concept of universal common descent. In other words, are all life forms that we see today the result of one universal common ancestor? So in this section of the book, there are several different topics that are explored. Fossils are just the first of many. So a reminder that when we look at the theory of evolution, there are 3 main definitions. Definition 2 deals with this concept of universal common descent. So essentially saying that all life today is on one big family tree, where the first life form ultimately gave rise to the millions of species that we see on Earth today. In your book, they use 2 different key terms, monophyletic and polyphyletic. Again, mono means one, poly means many, and so what we're referring to is essentially the number of family trees. So if all life descended from one universal common ancestor, then there's only one big family tree, the result of one life form, and as the theory of evolution puts it, the result of random mutations producing new variation, and through the process of natural selection producing new species. If, however, the view of a polyphyletic diversity of life is what the evidence best matches, then that really challenges the notion of the origins of life being without a creator and being purely the result of natural processes and random events. So to understand this chapter, you really have to know what a fossil is. And so we're talking about the remains of an organism, preserved remains, and sometimes this is a body part, such as a bone, a shell. Sometimes it's just a footprint or an impression made. So an important thing to know is that not all living things form fossils when they die. The process of fossilization is actually kind of a rare situation where something gets buried quickly before it can decompose, and through lots of time and lots of pressure, such as it gets buried under ash from a volcanic eruption, or maybe it gets buried under a large body of water, that over time it changes chemically and is preserved. And when we find fossils, we see that they occur in different strata or different layers. And one of the basic assumptions is that anything that is found in a deeper layer is the results of an older life form. Younger rocks would be more towards the surface, and that's where you would find the more recent fossils. So there are some exceptions to that where rocks have shifted because of uplifting, but as a general rule, the farther down it is, the older it is. So to understand the one tree of life concept, you really have to know how that tree was created. So if you can imagine the first time that a fossil is encountered, in other words, the oldest fossil of that particular life form that's encountered, imagine marking it with a dot. And then looking through all the fossil evidence and the most recent life form of that particular species that's found, the most recent one, marking that with a dot. So think about that as the point where it went extinct. The first dot down below is where it first formed, or the first example was found, and then connecting that with a vertical line to show the length of time that it existed on Earth. And you can do that with all of the different life forms that you encounter in the fossil record. So you have these series of vertical lines. Well, here is where the question comes in, is that how do you connect them? So Darwin illustrated changes from one species to another by connecting the dots, essentially by drawing in these diagonals, meaning that one life form would have, through this process of evolution or change, been transformed into this other one. And so when we start connecting the dots, so to speak, and drawing in these diagonal lines, we get something that looks like a tree. So in looking at our tree of life that we've seen, again, the original life form is there down at the bottom. The life forms that we see today are up at the top, but all those diagonal lines represent what's known as a transitional form. And so here is one section of the tree. So again, those diagonal lines would represent some kind of transitional form going from one form and then evolving or transforming into another. So we have found a few examples of transitional forms. One example is a group of fossils known as mammal-like reptiles. So essentially the idea is that this is a life form that exhibits some characteristics of mammals, some characteristics of reptiles, and the proposal is that this would be an example of a transitional form, something that represents the animal forms that would have evolved from reptiles and to later become mammals. So what's troubling, however, is if you look at the tree at large, there aren't very many examples of something that would be referred to as a transitional form. And so in Darwin's day, he recognized the lack of transitional forms, but his reply to that was that, well, we just haven't found them yet. And so he hypothesized that because some had been found, that with more time and more looking, we would find more, and that essentially the tree would be filled in. The problem, however, is that we've continued to look over the last 150 years, and still mostly those transitional forms are missing. So there are a few examples of things that you could argue are transitional. However, for the most part, those transitional forms are missing. And instead, what we tend to find in the fossil record is not this slow, gradual change from one form to another, as natural selection would propose, but instead geologically sudden appearances of new life forms that don't really seem to have any connection to anything that existed prior to that. So there are a few different examples of times where we've seen this sudden emergence of this diversity of life forms with nothing in between, nothing to connect it back to earlier fossils. So, and looking at this and talking about a 10 million year time span, that sounds like a really long time. However, if you take a look at the length of the Earth, so if we assume that the Earth is 4.6 billion years old and you stretch that out on 100 yards, we would see that a 10 million year time span is just a few inches on a full length of a football field. So again, 10 million years sounds like a long time, but if we're talking about geological time, that's really just a blink of an eye. And so what's interesting is that, again, there's this 10 million year period. This is referred to as the Cambrian explosion. And it's an explosion because if you look at what existed in the pre-Cambrian time period, there was very little life. And then suddenly, within about 10 million years, we see this huge diversity of life emerge. So over half of all the animal phyla appear in this Cambrian explosion. For this to make sense, we have to also remember where phylum is on the level of classification. Okay, so all animals fall in the animal kingdom. Right below that is the level of phylum. So over half of the different phyla suddenly appeared. You could think of as a phylum as a basic body plan. So what we're seeing is not just new species, but whole new body shapes and designs emerging very, very suddenly. And that's not the only case of a sudden appearance. Another case of a sudden appearance occurs later, again, over about a 10 million year time span, when we find mammals emerging. So about 15 new mammal orders suddenly appear, again, with very few transitional forms to link them back to previous fossils. Other examples, so we said the mammals, and it's not just animals. We found this in flowering plants as well. We also find this in the aquatic organisms, and then the biggest example and most dramatic example, of course, is the Cambrian explosion. Again, we see Darwin's own words recognizing the challenge that this presents for his theory. So already we saw a quote from him that made note of the fact that if you could find a complex organ system, something that couldn't be built step by step, that would be a significant challenge to his theory. And again, he recognized it in his original Origin of Species, that if we found fossils that showed a sudden appearance, that might be a good argument against universal common descent. And so definitely we are finding these examples of sudden geologic appearances. So one more time, we're looking at what's the difference between one branching tree, a monophyletic view, which is what the theory of evolution proposes, because again, the theory is arguing that life originated through purely natural processes and through random events, versus an orchard of trees, or a polyphyletic view, which by definition could not be a single random event. And so as we look at the fossil record, it's interesting to question, could common descent be true at low levels? In other words, within families, within a genus, could there be new species formed? So again, imagine the finches. We're talking about new types of finches formed versus birds in general emerging out of something that was not bird-like at all. So is it possible that all species of one finch, again, share a common ancestor, but don't share a common ancestor with all things that are chordates, or things that have a backbone? And so, again, looking at the fossil evidence, we see a few examples of transitional organisms, things that could be argued to be kind of an in-between or intermediate form between two groups. The mammal-like reptiles are often cited as an example. But again, those few examples are the exception. So the book raises the question, if you got only 3 questions right on a 100-point test, could you really argue that you know the material, and that based on those 3 correct answers, not the 97 that you missed? Kind of the same thing. What about all of the examples where transitional forms aren't found? Just because you found a few, does that really make the case? And so in actuality, we find pretty big gaps between the phyla, very few transitional forms, which provides a challenge for the idea that life evolved gradually over small incremental changes, as the theory of natural selection would propose. And that concludes this lecture on fossils.